Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we are going to discuss a module entitled Problems and Issues in Standard Generative Phonology in the course Advanced Phonology. Standard Generative Phonology. What does this term mean? Standard generative phonology is the model of generative phonology that was proposed for the first time in the Sound Pattern of English by Chomsky and Halle in 1968. The book Sound Pattern of English is also known as SPE for short. So the model of standard generative phonology is the model of generative phonology of SPE. Now we already started with this in the introductory model, talking about the problems that the generative phonological model in its early stage had. We sort of named the problem. It had to do with unilinear representation of forms. When we look at the development of phonological theory in the past 5 decades, we notice that there are at least 3 main consequences of the unilinear model of standard generative phonology based on the formal devices such as distinctive features, as well as the other formal devices such as braces and parentheses, etc., about which we have spoken. The first of these negative consequences was, as we have discussed, that the description of prosodic phenomena such as stress, tone, and intonation appeared to be very forced, resulting in very complex rules. And if you wanted to ask, were these rules like natural rules of phonology? Are rules of phonology as complicated as these? Or are these phenomena as complicated as the rules make them out to be? You find that actually the complications were addressed mainly towards the description of these phenomena such as stress, tone, and intonation. Then you might wonder, isn't it the case that it is possible that there is something wrong with the way we think of phonological representation of stress, tone, and intonation? So the negative consequence that we find of the standard generative phonological model was this extremely complicated formalism of rules, phonological rules. The second negative consequence of standard generative phonology model was the abstractness of forms. Somehow, the underlying representations that were proposed for the words, word structures, were such that they could contain abstract segments in them, segments which never occur. So they appeared to be quite far from being natural. A third negative consequence of the standard generative phonological model was that it entirely ignored the role of constraints in phonological theory. The issue of the relationship between constraints and rules always remained an issue to be discussed and debated. The consequence was that there were many phenomena which were shown to actually have to do with constraints, and perhaps the psychological reality of phonological rules could be questioned. This gave rise to a new theory which is one of the dominant theories of generative phonology today, known as Optimality Theory. We will have occasion to discuss the details of Optimality Theory, how to go about it, what are the various assumptions, and how are the analyses carried out in another module on Optimality Theory. Now, the background to the issue of abstractness. How does it arise? The problem with abstractness. The problem with abstractness arises from the requirement that grammars be as simple as possible. This arose from the general requirement in generative grammar, namely, given two grammars following the same modules, let us say phonological rules relating the underlying representation to the surface representation, a grammar which has less number of features is preferable to another grammar which has more number of features. So that grammar among all the grammars is preferable, which has the least number of features. This is what has come to be known as the simplicity criterion. This criterion is an evaluation criterion for evaluating amongst generative grammars to find out the most acceptable grammar. Now, alongside the simplicity criterion is another condition within generative phonology, generative grammar, namely the naturalness condition. What is naturalness condition? The naturalness condition is a condition on grammars that says that the surface representation of forms should be identical to the underlying representation unless it is motivated by phonological rules, unless it is necessary to show that the underlying representation must be more abstract than the surface representation, that there is no difference between underlying representation and the surface representation. The basic concern was to let grammars be as natural as possible. In order for grammars to be as natural as possible, the underlying representations had to come close to the surface representation, that is, the representation level of the utterances. Let us now turn to take a look at some of the degrees of abstractness before trying to look at the problem of abstractness and before deciding which of these different degrees are really problematic for phonological analysis. The least abstract forms are those which are non-alternating. What do we mean? What we mean by non-alternating forms is that you have only one form in all its occurrences in simple or complex words. Sometimes it may be a word without any morphological structure. So if we take a look at words such as book, for example, book, booking, in most of these forms you get the morpheme book, and it appears that it is non-alternating. However, although the relation among all the forms of book is almost one of total identity, on close examination you will find that there is always a little difference in one of the surface forms. For example, in the word book, the k is not released, whereas in booking, the k is released. So the word book is not exactly identical as booking. In most cases, it is so. Sometimes it's interesting to observe that in a second language variety like Indian English, it is quite likely that there are certain forms which have non-identical occurrences. For example, the word fall, pronounced as fall in Indian English. So it's always like fall, falling, the form is the same. Unlike in native English, where l will undergo some kind of a process like of velarization, where you'll have falling but fall, that kind of occurrence, that kind of pronunciation of l is not found in a second language variety. But the sum and substance of what we have just discussed is that although it is possible that theoretically that there are non-alternating forms, in fact, in reality, there's always some difference between one form or the other. The difference may not be significant. It is for this reason that the rules that relate the underlying representation to surface representation in so-called non-alternating forms are usually allophonic rules. That is, phonetic level rules. They do not have great consequence on the interpretation of the relationship between the underlying form and the surface form. That's one. The second, which is slightly higher degree of abstractness, is found among forms that are alternating. We already gave an example in the one of the previous modules about, let's say, divine and divinity, for example. So there's an alternation between the forms of divine. It is divine in divinity. This kind of alternation is found across all languages. Very few languages there are where there is not much alternating. There is only one of these types of languages, namely agglutinating languages, found in some language families such as Tibeto-Burman. In these languages of this family, for example, one may find that it is mostly the non-alternating forms that are commonly occurring, but the alternating forms common for most languages. Let's take a look at the alternating forms of a language such as Ganda. There are these liquids in Ganda, the African language, whose data are given in the problem book by Halle and Clements. Now, in Ganda, there is an alternation between l and r, as you notice on the screen. There is a certain generalization possible to predict which of the two occurrences is by rule, according to rule, following a certain rule. Thus, what we find is, if you look at all the data, what you find is that it is l which changes to r after front vowels. So that's the rule, minus back vowels. And then the rule is stated as you see it on the screen. Now, this is a good example of alternating forms of morphemes. Now, sometimes the alternation may not be only between two different pronunciations involving two different, let's say, allophones. Sometimes there may be multiple alternations in given words. Let's take a look at the data on your screen. What we find here is that there are three types of alternation. One is the alternation between voiced versus voiceless obstruents. The other is the alternation between the vowels A and E. And there is a third alternation involving shift of stress in these words. Now, what is of interest in the multiple alternations in these words is that there is not one, but more than one phonological rule must be shown to be related to each other. We can take these up one by one. How do you decide that that a certain rule really is at work in a given language? For example, when it comes to looking at the alternation between voiceless and voiced obstruents, you have to decide as to what the rule is. Is it the voicing rule, which says voiceless obstruents are underlying, which become voiced because of a phonological rule of voicing? Or is it the case that the devoicing rule is at work? That is, the underlying representation has voiced obstruents, and there is a rule of devoicing which says voiced obstruents become voiceless in certain environments. The phonological analysis of these forms requires that we make a choice between the two possible rules. If you look at how these rules work, you will find that the choice depends on the counter evidence available for each of these two rules. Look at the entire data, you find that if we propose a voicing rule, then according to the voicing rule, there should be always voiced sounds occurring in voiceless sounds occurring in certain environments. On the other hand, if we assume the rule to be devoicing, then it should always be the case that in those contexts where devoicing rule takes place, there should always be voiceless obstruents. You will find that in these data, there is counter evidence available for the voicing rule, but there is no counter evidence available for the devoicing rule. We just choose between the two rules. We just choose the devoicing rule to be the rule at work in this language, and thus the underlying representation must have the voiced obstruents, not the voiceless obstruents. So that's the one of the criteria of choosing between analysis. It is the same with the other alternating segments, such as between A and E. The choice here is either A becomes E, that means there is a raising rule, or that E becomes A, there is a lowering rule. And look at the data and the E text and find out which of the two rules is at work here, so that only one of the rules is chosen as the phonological rule of this grammar. And then there's the stress shift rule. So when we come to have multiple phonological alternation of forms, we have to be very careful with deciding on the correct phonological rule. Two rules may be exactly similar in terms of their simplicity. Both may be equally simple, but only one of them will be chosen to be part of the phonological grammar, the one that does not have any counter evidence compared to the one which has counter evidence. So the criterion of counter evidence is very important in choosing between phonological rules for these cases. Now, these cases that we have just reviewed are cases of abstractness of underlying representations. It is very clear that we must posit abstract underlying representations whenever we have two systematically differing alternations of morphemes. Now, there is a third type of case where we have alternating shapes, but the underlying form of these alternating shapes of a morpheme has a segment that does not appear on the surface. English, for example, has such forms. In English, there is a rule that voiced obstruents somehow don't occur following nasal consonants at the end of words or before certain suffixes. Thus, we have words such as, let's say, B-O-M-B, pronounced as bomb, and B-O-M-B-I-N-G is bombing. However, the B surfaces in forms such as bombard. So, in these forms, bomb, bombing, bombard, of course, you can posit a B as the underlying representation and say that B is dropped or deleted in forms such as bomb and bombing. So far, so good, although for words such as bomb and bombing, the representation B-O-M-B is abstract, yet it is well motivated. However, what we find is, as a general rule of obstruent, let's say, deletion, we have cases where the deleted obstruent always remains deleted. For example, the deletion of G in words such as sing. In a word such as sing, it is sing, singing, singer. There is never any form where S-I-N-G is pronounced with the 4 segments as singer, unlike in bombard. Now, yet because of the general rule of obstruent, voiced obstruent deletion following nasals, what we have is a case where the underlying representation must be shown to have the voiced obstruent following nasals in these forms, such as sing. Now, in order to relate the underlying form to the surface form for these English words, we need to have certain, at least 2 rules. One which says that the nasal assimilates in place to the following voiced obstruent, and the other which says after nasal assimilation, so na becomes ma, na becomes ma, then the voiced obstruent is deleted. That's how we get sing, not sin. So there is an abstraction, level of abstraction, which is still sort of acceptable because of the general nature of the rules that apply. Words such as sing, singing, singer are thus an exception to this, but they seem to be well motivated. This much degree of abstractness is well accepted in phonological theory, and most phonologists, phonological analysts of English seem to accept this. Now there is a 4th degree, the last degree of abstractness, which seems to be really problematic. For cases of this last degree of abstractness, what we find is that there are non-alternating forms, and yet for the non-alternating forms, we have a segment in the underlying form that never surfaces, never at all. Now, we have, for example, case of in English, namely the diphthong realizations of English which are traceable to long vowels, as we have discussed before, such as divine, divinity, etc. Take a look at those forms on the screen. Whereas there is some kind of regularity found in the alternation, these alternations where we have diphthongs related to short vowels because of the application of two rules, namely diphthongization and trisyllabic laxing or shortening of vowels. Sometimes we have representations on certain forms which have non-alternating diphthongs. There is no form where these diphthongs have corresponding short vowels, such as for I we have E, no form at all. For example, in the word right, R-I-G-H-T, it always is right, righteous, always right. Now the question is, how do you, what is the underlying form for right? In the sound pattern of English, because there is no restriction on the kind of rules that we can formulate, the generality of a rule seems to motivate or justify positing a segment within a morpheme that never surfaces in the pronunciation of that morpheme. Now, Chomsky and Halle propose that a complicated analysis whereby the word right has an abstract segment such as kh, following a general kind of development of English. Historically there was a sound like kh, as can be seen in the German corresponding word recht. So recht, and so right has r, long e, kh and t, and then it is shown that the long e followed by kh becomes a diphthong, so there is diphthongization, and then that kh is deleted, etc., etc. Now on the screen you have the derivation of these forms, as you can see. Now these are the cases, such as the cases like right, related to the underlying representation, riecht, that are a real problem in phonological theory. Paul Kiparsky raised this debate about the psychological reality of these forms and the validity of the presence of rules in the grammar which seem to justify abstract forms, that is, segments that never occur on the surface. In the following modules, we will take a close look at these real cases of problems in analyzing abstract representations of forms. Now, to summarize, in this module we began with discussing the problems of abstractness in the standard generative phonological model. We tried to trace the background to the problem of abstractness, namely the importance of the simplicity criterion and the naturalness condition. And then we took a close look at multiple levels of abstractness of forms, and then tried to see how of all these multiple levels, while some are justifiable, others seem to be extremely hard to accept. Thank you.